Over the weekend, the South African Rainbow Alliance launched. It's an alliance of smaller parties. This is all, of course, ahead of next year's elections. It's already cost Joburg Speaker and Cope Councillor Colleen Makhubele her job. Her party says it never sanctioned the plan to join SARA. And, of course, we're heading into our very first registration weekend for the elections in the next few days. Let's discuss this now with political analyst Ongama Mtimka, who comes to us from Joburg. Ongama, thanks so much for joining us. You know, we know the elections are going to happen somewhere between May and August next year. We're not quite sure when. I would say it's probably closer to August because there's probably quite a lot to sort out. But if we look at the formation of SARA, I mean, it's nothing on the scale of the Moonshot Pact, which became, I think, the multi-party coalition spearheaded by the DA, but involving other parties as well, Action SA among them. Is it significant, though, that we're seeing these little sort of coalitions setting up before the elections? Is it great for the voter because they know who they're voting for, they know who their party is getting into bed with?
Good evening to you, Sally, and your viewers. So this is quite interesting in the sense that we've been attempting to pursue coalitions in South Africa maybe as far back as the mid-2000s, and they gained steam since 2016. The parties would not be showing that they are learning if they were not making attempts at forming broad alliances that demonstrate their ability or willingness to try and play the coalition's game a little better. This attempt to try and form pre-election coalitions is helping voters to be able to identify who is likely going to align with who. And that's important because if you follow the social media conversations, at times voters have felt hard done by seeing parties form coalitions which they never thought were possible before the elections, because those coalitions would be drawing from quite a diverse base of constituencies, and some constituencies would feel betrayed by those coalitions. So now that we're seeing coalition attempts before elections, they're showing to voters who is likely to go into a coalition with who, and that helps to bring in a little bit of predictability from a support base by the voters.
Do you rate the chance of smaller parties this coming election? You know, the ANC, we're hearing that it may well fall below 50% support for the very first time. A lot of people say, well, who do we vote for? Do you think that people will be looking for these smaller parties to perhaps push their views forward? Do you think the era of the small party is coming? Or ultimately, do you think people are going to stick with the big guns, the top three, to kind of get the most power out of their vote?
Interesting question. So my view is that our system is experiencing what I may call dynamic fragmentation. In terms of that, you are seeing the phenomenon of small parties, or what's called also short-lived parties, as a permanent feature of our system, even as particular small parties come and go. So indeed, next year might see a lot of small parties failing to make the threshold to go into parliament. Remember what happened to Themba Godi's party, for example. But also, the idea of small parties in the system is not going to go anywhere, because next year we are going to have a lot more smaller parties in. And what's interesting for me, Sally, is that these are splinters mainly from the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance is experiencing what the ANC has been experiencing throughout the democratic period. Remember, its own trajectory was one of consolidation, you know, first with a faction of the New National Party and then also with the Independent Democrats. It's only now that it is actually going into an election and it's facing its own splinters. Obviously, the ANC has had many splinters itself, the economic freedom, the UDM initially, then COPE, and then the economic freedom fighters. But also it's looking at what the RET faction so far is morphing into two small parties. How realistic those two small parties are going to make it into parliament remains to be seen. But my view, to answer your question, is that the centrist splinters are going to attract voters, especially if you look at, for example, Action SA. Action SA is clearly going to draw from the Democratic Alliance, but Rise and Busa are going for the electoral market of non-voters. And then you have, I don't know whether it's called Shiluva. Yeah, Shiluva. I think that's going to be a regional party in Gauteng. If it gains traction nationally, I think it's going to be very difficult to gain traction nationally. But these splinters are going to appeal to people who have not been voting. And I think that they help those people that were not keen to change parties those who were not keen to change parties and preferred to rather stay at home on election day have now got options to actually go and cast their vote for parties that are on the moderate side of the political spectrum.
Do you expect to see more pre-election coalitions popping up?
That's interesting. I think that there is no limit to how many of these arrangements can be made. And I don't think that the door is going to be closed completely on who is allowed in and who's kept out. But the real games are going to begin post-election, where you may find that even for example, and this is my argument, that the ANC next year is going to be the best positioned party to form a coalition because its margin to reach 50% is not going to be significantly less than the mid-40s. So imagine a situation where the multi-party coalition faces a task that's impossible to constitute a coalition. Guess what happens to the allies in the coalition? My view is that some of them may want to actually change their stance against the ANC and, in fact, end up siding with the ANC. Or the ANC might have enough supporters from the newcomers that are going to be in parliament. And in so doing, it might need neither the affiliates of the multi-party charter nor the opposite, which would be the EFF, and may just move with these centrist parties to constitute a coalition.
This weekend, we're seeing the first voter registration weekend. We know, of course, that we can go online and register as well. One of the big concerns of the IEC is that young people are not going to be drawn to register or to vote. You've spoken earlier about the dynamic fragmentation, and that might draw people to vote who've not been interested in voting before. And as you say, things are going to change. There's going to be so much change as we run up to the elections. What do you think will get young people invested in our democracy and in voting? Do you think it's sometimes as simple as the ease of being able to register?
I think one of the things we must appreciate in South Africa is that young people's political socialization or becoming aware of politics and finding a political identity or being able to be energized enough to take action usually happens in institutions of higher learning. Indeed, to some degree within the schooling system it happens, but in democratic South Africa, it's not as strong as it was pre-apartheid in basic education. In higher education, however, students soon realize what their place in society is, and therefore get galvanized to be interested in politics. So my sense is that those young people, the fact that you have a lower degree of young people who are participating or are interested in politics is a function of how delayed political socialization is, not only in South Africa, but across the world. And another dynamic that's interesting, though, Sally, is the shift in the median age in terms of our young people. So I think 25 was the median age in terms of our population, but that's shifted, I think, towards 28, 29, if I recall the statistics correctly. That's got implications in terms of interest in participation, because evidence has shown that the more mature young people are, the more interested they become in politics, because they become political citizens who are quite more aware of the consequences of the failure of the political system than their under 25 counterparts. So my interest, my hypothesis is that we're going to see more young people in next year's election voting. And indeed, this weekend is the acid test for just how many as a share of the youth population are going to turn out and register to vote.
Thank you so much. Always great to chat to you, political analyst Ongama Mtimka, coming to us from Joburg in the Eastern Cape.